start with maybe it's an obvious question, maybe not. But maybe I'll start with you, Owen. But I'd like all of you to answer this. Did you set out to write a book about fathers and sons, or did that come much later? Was the father the key figure in the book from the very beginning, or was it something that evolved as you began to write?
I think he was always looming. I think he became a much bigger character than I thought he was going to be. But I mean, my book is mostly about, or at least initially, the whole first section of the book is about the son of the pair making an independent film that goes terribly wrong. But the idea, or at least part of the idea, a couple different things contributed to it that I had for this was in reading a book about Orson Welles, Peter Bogdanovich's recollection of watching Welles watch Magnificent Ambersons, which had been famously butchered, and according to Bogdanovich, he started to weep, even though there were a whole bunch of people in the room watching him watch the movie. I got to thinking about that and about some other things and what it would be like to make something intensely important to you and then have it go really wrong in a spectacularly embarrassing way as opposed to kind of a tragic way, which is in the Magnificent Ambersons, in the case of that. So, but then as I was going forward, my sort of father character got bigger and bigger and more Wellesian and sort of came to fill out the rest of the story.
How about you, Stuart?
Yeah, I think the initial impetus of my book was a scene that I began writing where a son is walking, sees his father randomly in the city and is walking after him. When he finally catches up to him in a restaurant, the father slips a note to a bartender and leaves, and the note says, "If you ever see me like this again, don't follow me." And that was the impetus for the book. I kept the scene and took the father out and put another character in. But that initial kernel of the scene that gave me all these questions, like who were these characters? Why did the father not want to see the son? I kind of knew that I wanted them to be. I knew I wanted the conflict between them to be about money, and so the book sort of came organically from answering those questions. So the initial impulse for writing the book was just that moment, those two people, father and son.
Yeah, I mean, I came up with the title and sons, and you can't really avoid it with that. You can't like make it about a circus trainer. So yeah, I always knew that the father-son relationship would be the main aspect of the story, and I had my son was just starting to get a little bit older, 6 and 7 years old, and that's when you're kind of relating to him in a more paternalistic way, and so that you can see where not only do you differ from your father, but you're also unfortunately, or in some cases fortunately, the same. So that was interesting to me, and to be able to track this boy who was kind of coming of age, and my father who's about to be 80, and his health has been a little bit wobbly, so to see the other side of that as well, I was ready to kind of write about that, and then write about it in terms of New York City, because this is where I grew up, and really trying to do that story.
And you made a choice to have the narrator not be one of the sons of the father and son relationship is mirrored in a way, but it's also seen at one remove from your narrator. Was that part of it originally, that you want that distance originally?
Yeah, I did. I really like unreliable narrators, and I kind of wanted to throw a little bit of everything into this book, which is probably what makes it fun and also exasperating in some places. But so I liked unreliable narrators, and I wanted to mirror, you have this author and his 3 sons, and then you have a person, oldest friend of the author, who's used in the author's fiction, and his son, who always kind of had his face pressed up against the window of this family that he wanted to be a part of. So I wanted to kind of explore that aspect of it, and then do it by way of what we do when we make fiction, what is real, what is not real, who is actually telling us this story, you know, all those kinds of things that make it. The best part about writing for me is thinking about writing. It's not the actual writing. So when you have an unreliable narrator, you're thinking a lot about subtext and things like that, and then because the writing doesn't tend to be a lot of fun.
I'm just curious. So, what's your split there? When you're writing a book, are you spending most of your time writing or most of your time thinking?
Napping, mostly.
Yeah.
Lots of napping. I shower 4 times a day because it can be very dirty. Yeah, I mean, usually the thinking is that's what you do when you're not writing. You know, that's when you're walking down the street or walking the dog, or you know, you're kind of sucking in everything that you can. And usually it's about 6 months before you start a project when you start getting really excited and thinking about it and making weird connections. And then slowly all that enthusiasm gets chipped away as you start to actually write.
Do you have anything to say about that process for yourselves?
No, it's pretty agonizing, but
I have the same experience. The anticipating of the writing is the only pleasurable part.
oh yeah, well, because it's always so much better in your imagination. Like if you just whatever you end up getting on pages, even bears the remotest resemblance to the masterpiece that you had in mind when you set out. You're
Just immediately
feel pretty
lost.
triumphant.
It's immediately lost as soon as you begin typing.
Yeah.
It's all finished.
I'm curious, Stuart, what did your father do? Or what was his career?
He is a dentist.
He's a dentist?
Yeah, he's a dentist.
So my father was an investment banker. Your father was a writer, or is a writer. He's, you know, I was dyslexic growing up, and your father's books were the first things I could read and actually enjoy. He was very important to me. But what was it like deciding to be a writer, you know, because I never wanted to be an investment banker.
Right.
Did you do dentistry? Was that? Because that's also very family, that gets passed down.
It would have been a lot easier. I mean, could have chosen dentistry. No, I have sadly always wanted to do this. But I wonder, I mean, sometimes I think it's like a disposition rather than an occupation, writer, wanting to be a writer, or just doing what it is that we do, you know, to write one book, to write more than one book, I guess implies that there's some sort of, pathologize it too much, but there's something that we're, you know, trying to activate on the page. But yeah, I've never considered dentistry. Thankfully, he had never tried to force it. It's not an attractive occupation to try to, you know, show off to your child, you know. So you have to.
Well, it's a very
crane,
and you have a wonderful smile, by the way. The teeth are excellent.
Yeah, as a small child, it's not like, you know, if your dad was like a baseball player or something.
Right.
It's just like, here's the show. It's like a lot of grime and blood and
Suffering,
yeah.
But did your dad try to steer you clear of it, or do you say do what you're going to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to be a ball player, like just what everybody else when I was a kid, and but I also had a sense of what a hard, I mean, not in like a coal mining kind of way, but what a hard job being a writer was. I mean, both my parents were writers, and so they both were in their offices, you know, beating their selectrics to death for like, you know, 6 hours a day. It just didn't seem that awesome from the outside looking in. I don't know. It's funny, this comes to mind. There was this guy I went to high school with. I went to from Bangor, Maine, and this guy who lived away just around the corner from me. His dad was a mortician, and we used to, for whatever reason, I think his dad was widowed or something like that. And he would be away a lot on the weekends, so we would party our asses off at this guy's funeral home. And I remember, because it was my friend's dad, and I just remember one time, you know, I was looking for the bathroom. I never forgot this, and the guy was like, no, not that. You know, that's not the room to go into. That's the room. And you know, I think about like something like that. To me, that would be a much heavier, you know. Because that is really like, that's the sort of thing that really runs in the family. And you know, taking on writing, which I resisted for a long time, it was a little lighter than that.
Yeah. Easier than embalming.
Right.
Did he become a mortician?
No, I don't think. I think that I mean, still got the family name, but I don't think that it's that family anymore. They all thinking about
But
it.
there's a book now.
I don't know. I'm super squeamish, so.
One of the interesting things in reading all three books is that even with the most loquacious of the fathers in the books, Booth, there's so much that these men are not saying. These fathers are so mysterious in a way. There's so much unsaid in the father-son relationship. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because it's not the kind of relationship, I mean, that makes for interesting novels, those kind of things held back, secrets, unexplored territory, but there's not sort of all the emotional outpouring that one feels in the mother-daughter relationship. So can you talk a little bit about how you dealt with that as writers? Or if you notice it, maybe I just notice it as someone more connected to a mother-daughter.
I can take this.
Thank you.
You got this. This is just in your
Yeah.
wheelhouse.
Well, this was one of the things that I was most interested in when I was writing the book, not the sort of kind of stereotypical reticence that men of a certain generation have, but this sort of preconceived, like a pretext between father and son, which is this, you know, which I think so often is just about disappointment, implied disappointment that, and I don't think is necessarily a gendered, it's not a gendered thing, is, you know, the sort of implied disappointment between the generations, between children and their parents. In the case of my book, you know, my narrator, Hilly, has always been uncomfortable about his father's money, his father's job, his father's attitude, I mean, everything about it, which sort of kind of, you know, these are opinions that he's made up in his adolescence, which are, you know, an unreliable assessment of his father's character. And that is something that's always fascinated me in fiction and in life, which is this idea of expectation, who you're expected to be when you're young, and how you carry that with you as you age. Because I think, especially now, it would have to be inconceivably cruel to have a parent really lay it out for you. I suppose maybe like Kafka's father, where you're working in the, you know, where you're working in the factory, and I remember there's I think a note in Kafka's journals about writing the Metamorphosis, where he's like, this would have been a really great book if I didn't have to go to work every day.
Mm-hmm.
That stuff's always the stuff that's fascinated me, and that's what I kind of put into the novel. That sort of those notions of disappointment and expectation.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's mutually assured disappointment, because the father is going to feel disappointment for the son's going to feel you know, it's like that kind of weird little loop. But for me, it was my dad, you know, is about to be 80, and he's a very kind of waspy guy, and grew up in that kind of generation in which the mother did all of the parenting and the father really was not present until I could start participating in the things that he liked to do. So once I could actually, you know, and it was all like the most super waspy things you could do. Like once I could fish, I could hang out, fly fish, I could hang out with my dad. I remember, fly fishing is the most complicated thing to do, and I would always get, you know, these incredible knots. And my father, who was a seriously good fisherman, would just be focused on fishing while I'm in tears trying to untangle the knot, not like 5 yards away from him. And golf and duck hunting, it was all that kind of crap. And so I was interested in that idea of exploring those kinds of men who were also the fathers of all my friends growing up. And what if one of those fathers also was a writer and laid it all out in his books, yet in his personal life was totally locked in and unknowable. So you could read his books and you could say, gosh, this is the father I want. And yet, on your day-to-day, across the kitchen table, this is the father you got. And it's nothing like the dad that you
in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my book, it's sort of a reverse of the maybe a more typical father-son relationship, because in a lot of ways the father is much more comfortable in his skin, and the son, he has a number of grievances with his father, but maybe even more than that, he's very angry at the way everybody else likes his father so much. This charisma that everybody else gets is sort of an anti-charisma between the father and the son.
And he's an actor too.
Right,
He's like
and it's a very theatrical thing. And,
yeah.
and I think one of the things that the book is about the son sort of discovering that there are depths that he wants from his father that he can't get to because they just don't exist. And so it's sort of about, what's so appealing about him is that he's kind of a two-dimensional person, and that's a lot less work.
There's a great scene, though, in the book, I wonder if you could describe it, where he's walking with his mother, right, and she's telling him, do you remember what I'm talking about? And she's saying to him something like, well, do you understand what's good about your father? Do you...
Right. Yeah, I think it's just his father does, he does all these theatrical things, which are very attractive to everybody else, but, I mean, you remembers what it was like when you were a kid, and even if your parents would drive you to school, could be an intensely mortifying experience. And then just imagine if your father was, taking you to school in his pajamas and, juggling things he came across and doing voices and stuff. And it's funny, I never talk about my child, but since we're all close friends, I took my daughter to school the other day, and she's 4, and sometimes she's a little resistant to go, and so I started doing this thing where I pretend to be like her little brother and be like, "Where's the class?" And at first she was into it, and then she was like, "Don't do that." And I had that flashback, back to when I was a kid, thinking about things my parents would do. So
Yeah, I get that all the time. You can be crazy on the way to school, but once we get to school, you're a serious guy.
Try to be normal.
Yeah. So then I pretend to be like robot dad.
Yeah.
And that. The other kids love it. But,
Yeah. So your book, if memory serves, your book is the only book of the 3, though, where the mother is, even at any point, trying to mediate the relationship between the son and the father at all. I don't think that's present in your book, and I know it's not in yours.
well, I have there's the mother who, she has like a little scene where she's coming back, and I try to do like an Alice Munro short story in there. I fail epically, but I try.
What do you mean by that?
Well, my book is, I try to do like various reproductions, and echoes. So I wanted to give, I knew it was a very male-centric book, so I had one chapter that was the wife of the great writer, and I decided I'm going to use all the Alice Munro tropes that I can, because I'm not only a big fan, but I just wanted to have that little Alice Munro moment. It was kind of like a playing off of Alice Munro. It was fun to do, because it's always fun to have another template. It makes your writing a little bit easier when you're stealing from something else that works. And you can kind of, so I threw in a train because Alice Munro. I even threw in like a fake Alice Munro book of new short stories that the woman is reading, and I put in the beginning of a fake Alice Munro short story within this fake Alice Munro short story like thing, and it was kind of my attempt to do the female story within this very male-dominated story.
this isn't exactly a father-son question, but I wondered if, I just have to ask because it's been on my mind as I've been reading your book. Did you ever feel like you've got so many amazing stories? The writer, there's a way you have of sort of leaking out the the major elements of certain parts of his books,
Right.
And so the reader sees these sort of shadows of what all these books are about and major turns in the book. Did you feel like you were burning ideas, or were those all sort of organic and you just
Those are
Because
really
I mean, there's like 1 million books in the book.
Yeah, yeah. I keep on saying it. It's 14 books for the price of one. Yeah, no. Those were always just okay. I need to. I figured out the titles because I wanted all the titles to riff off of Ampersand, which is his big famous Catcher in the Rye book. So I wanted all those books because he's such a narcissist that I wanted it all to echo off of Ampersand. So all those titles have something to do in my mind with Ampersand. And then I was like, okay, I've got these titles. What are these books going to be about? And I really kind of, when I came to those moments where I had to give a little chunk, I just kind of sat back and did the chunk. And that was totally liberating because it was like writing a novel in a paragraph. So you don't have to worry about all the other crap, like plot and likable characters and all this other. You can just do like a little vignette that hopefully from that vignette you can extrapolate a whole book. Though I did have this moment, and then I did a website, and I liked the idea so much I really went into detail on all these made-up A.N. Dyer books. But now I'm starting to think about writing a new book, and I'm like, fuck, I should just use some of these A.N. Dyer books. But I don't think I can. I don't think I can without it being just ridiculous. So,
Well, you could start writing as Dan.
yeah, but I think the book needs to sell more copies. For me to do that.
Stuart, do you have anything to say?
The burning ideas is a very. I had read your book, and I had the same impulse. There's so much just material that's generated. I think we're always sort of scribbling. I am always scribbling ideas down, and I was lining them up. Well, after I finish this book, maybe I'll get to this. Like every idea has infinite promise to it. So it's good to know that you're. It's good. It's refreshing to hear writers aren't precious about their.
It is liberating not to actually have to do
Oh my God, yeah.
all the sort of tissue, the tissue in between the big things.
And then there's one little scene where the writer is crawling across his office looking for Vicodin, and he comes across a sheet of paper that is like just a piece of writing, a random writing. And that was just something I'd written like 20 years ago that I always liked. It's like, I'm just going to throw this in because I like it. It had nothing to do with anything. I'm going to throw it in because I can do that. This is going to be my repository for all these things.
So, from that I take it that you didn't start this book out with a very definite structure.
Oh no, it was really structured.
It
before.
was, yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty well, not a detailed outline, but a detailed story kind of arc. And I knew it was going to be the amount of chapters it was. I knew it was going to be divided into threes, so 3 sons. And I knew that it was going to jump from voice to voice because one trick of writing is that when in doubt, have multiple narrators because invariably your reader's going to like one of those characters and they're going to keep on reading just to figure out what that one character is doing. So it's a way to kind of be safe. It's also what Richard Powers does, but he does it so brilliantly.
I just read this
Yeah.
new book. I want to switch a little, just a tiny bit from Fathers and Sons because in all 3 of your books, place is so vividly drawn. And the places are so different. I think, and your book moves the most. So we have both that college campus, which is Curie Williams, I don't know, and then we have LA and the whole area. And I want to start with you, David, because the book is so New York. It's such a New York book, and talk to you a little bit about writing about the place that you spent your whole life in. And are you tempted not to? How do you feel about that?
I was in the beginning of when I was writing other things, my first book and short stories, I never would write about New York because I grew up in a very specific version of New York, which I had a hard time with, which is the Upper East Side and a very kind of overprivileged, pampered existence that I always kind of, I reacted against that, and I thought that, and also because no one would talk in the family, it was all silence, and I was drawn to those stories of kind of extreme behavior and extreme situations. So so many of my college short stories are about people shooting heroin and robbing convenience stores. I mean, stuff that I've never, come across in a million years, but that felt legitimate. That felt real. And it wasn't until, I got in my late 30s, early 40s that I felt like, okay, I can now write a book about New York and specifically about this very strange world that is the Upper East Side, and I can just throw everything at it and really try to do it. So once I gave myself kind of permission to do that, it was a lot of fun because I do, I know it well, and you can kind of take people through the locations and the museums and the park in a way in which I think it's kind of evocative, and it was fun to write. To be honest, it was kind of easy for me to do.
And Stuart, that coastline, is that a place you spend a lot of time?
Not a lot of time. I spent some time there, and a lot of my books take place in the far edge of Cape Cod, and for me, it was a place I loved. It's a place that's very beautiful, and to have it as a central location of the novel just afforded me the luxury of being able to imagine it every day, which is one of the good bonus. That's a good perk of being a fiction writer, I think, is to imagine yourself in these nice places. It's one of those places like I've always wanted to spend more time, and so the book was just a really kind of wonderful excuse to daydream. It was a lot of wish fulfillment.
Did you actually make a trip there to scope it out?
It's a place I've gone. I grew up in Boston,
Uh-huh.
so it's a place I had gone to over the years. It's just one of those places that you go to and you're like, why don't I go here more often? Or why can't I be one of the people that lives here instead of one of the people who visits here? But no, I didn't. I didn't do a research trip.
Uh-huh.
Because
Did you ever go online to strangers' Flickr accounts just to see the
no.
to try and describe that, right?
So I made up a town
Uh-huh.
that didn't exist, so I didn't have to be really wed to sort of the exact details, just because I was convinced I would get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's uniquely challenging about writing with New York City, right? Is there's a lot more pressure to be correct about where things are located,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
not putting in imaginary buildings.
Right. That would have been fun to put in a building from Toronto, just because so many movies about Toronto.
Exactly. Right.
So I kind of
Yeah.
And it seems in your book, the place just comes organically from the story, and that rather than the opposite.
They're just all places I've lived, and
They are.
yeah, I'm just limited by that. One, I can write about anything as long as I can force it into places that I've actually been.
Okay.
I find it pretty difficult to. I can do little parts of things in places I've never been, but the farther I get away from some place I know, the less I believe it. So it's discouraging.
I'm going to open it to questions from the audience now. We have time for some questions, more questions you have for each other, but I thought there might be people in the audience who had a few questions about why these guys are writing about the father-son relationship in their books. Yes.
I just happen to be in the middle, or not quite the middle yet, of Henry Roth's Call It Sleep. Have you read that?
a long time ago, yeah.
Just bought a copy. Does that count?
Is it about father and son?
Yeah, well, actually, it's a family immigrated in the early part of the 20th century, Lower East Side kind of thing, and not necessarily always in that location, Bronx, Brooklyn, but an absolutely abominable father.
Well, it's interesting.
And so it's one of the things that drew me here tonight.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered whether the father that each of you would speak of had any eccentricities.
Fictional fathers or actual fathers?
Oh no, actually.
Actual fathers.
My father is all eccentricity. Most people are all eccentricity. have yet to meet the
We're taking this.
Yeah.
Did you use your father at all for research?
No. Thankfully.
How'd I get?
But do you feel like you get opened up for the autobiography question, just having a father in the book?
Yeah. I was just saying to somebody the other day, I feel like, for me, I mean, my father's a famous guy. I could write a book about, you know, coal miners in West Virginia, and people will be like, "Is your father mine?" You know. There's nothing. I mean, that's like it's the first line of my obituary. It's, you know, it is what it is, you know, and so you just there's no escape. Yeah.
Well, with me, so my book it has the concept, the kind of emotional concept that's like my father. My father is a very sweet, lovely, shy man. But in the galley, and I can only read from my galley because reading from the actual book, I will see things that are wrong, and I will die, and it makes me embarrassed, and I want to run into a closet. So I figure that I must have made the change between the galley and the actual book, you know. So that's why I read from the galley. And in the back of this galley, there is a little Q&A with a friend, in which we talk about my real father, and it was, you know, I kind of laid it all out there, and my father read the galley, and I was not so much worried about him actually reading the book, but I was worried about the Q&A at the end, because it talks about, you know, I walk around the streets doing imaginary eulogies in my head about my father, because it's the only way I can really talk to him when he's dead, because talking to him face, it's, you know, it's between me and my shrink, and now you. So I was petrified that he was going to read this part of the galley. And he reads the book, and he's like, "You know what my favorite part of the book was?" I'm like, "What?" He's like, "The Q&A at the end. Is that going to be in the real book?" I'm like, "No, it's just for the galley thing." You know? He's like, "You like that?" He's like, "Oh yeah, that was great. I really loved that." I was like, "Whoa, that blew me away," because I was not expecting that, because that's where I really talked about him as a real person.
You had a question?
Well, David sort of started to answer it. I mean, just the person that's been brought up, I would, of course, dying to know what it was like for your fathers to read it, and what interaction you might have had with them after that. After the event, if they're reading it, how did that go?
It's always a fraught experience to give your writing to anybody that's close to you, for sort of the obvious reasons, because, you know, people are always worried that they're going to be reflected poorly in it. But the opposite side of it, I was talking about this last night with people, is that a lot of people who are close to you will read in to the book and make assumptions that, you know, you've based a character on them or an incident on them, and, you know, so much of the process of fiction writing is sort of accumulation of moments that you store up in your life and that you sort of subvert into, you know, put it through whatever process that you put it through to turn it into fiction, and it's a lot of times it's difficult to remember where you get things, or, you know for a fact that you made this up from a different point of reference, but it's generally just a really fraught experience to give it to people. And I've tried waiting till the very last moment to give people books, or, you know, showing people, you know, warning them for months, or but you can't win.
Yeah, I find it a little fraught giving the book to my mother, my father, you know. But at the same time, I sort of have I've just put out the vibe, like, just tell me it's great. If it sucks, let somebody else tell me. You know what I mean? Like that. So let's maintain our thing, and just, you know, because I don't want. I think it's especially because they're in the field. It seems like it's a little bit of an unfair pressure on both sides to say. So what do you really think?
Yeah. I think that, you know, people are always making guesses about who a character might be. In a novel, I don't know if you read that letter that Philip Roth wrote about the human stain when he was so annoyed.
To Wikipedia.
Yeah,
great.
Because people said, "Oh, well, obviously the human stain is based on contemporary art," and he said, "No, it absolutely is not." And he actually corrected the Wikipedia entry on that, and said, "No, it really isn't." So people will always, I think, if they know some little bit of information, they'll extrapolate it out to what the truth is.
I thought that was a great piece, but I couldn't figure out why he cared.
I think,
Do you know what I mean? Like why he felt like because he corrected it to say that he'd kind of been inspired by another guy.
Right.
Right? So it wasn't like he was demanding,
that he
you
made
know,
it up.
complete originality or something like that. He was just wanting to say, no, actually I was inspired by this different thing.
He probably got that question one time too many.
Yeah, maybe that was it.
Yeah, or maybe he's just getting grumpy.
Yeah,
That's what internet access does too.
Yeah.
Everyone has access to too much.
But Patrimony is a great book about fathers that he wrote. I mean, that was like, you know, that's pretty powerful stuff.
I can just, on that note, say that he appeared here. We had a tribute to Philip Roth, and he appeared here. And I met him. I was very nervous about meeting him. And so I sat down with him and I said, Mr. Roth, thank you so much for agreeing to read here. I'd like you to read for 20 minutes, and I'd like you to read from a work of fiction. And he said, it's very nice to meet you, Ms. Tomasi. I'll be reading for 45 minutes, and I'll be reading from Patrimony. And I said, okay. So that's how that went, and it was wonderful. He read for 45 minutes, and it was really awesome. It's a wonderful book, actually. Do we have some more questions, Ms. Robbins? Yes.
I'm just curious, as a reference for us, just to kind of be able to peek into your minds, hypothetical, if your books were turned into movies, who would you cast as the father?
Who would I cast as the father? My father. Oh my God. Some Robert Redford with a beard? I don't know, someone who's kind of that waspy.
How about maybe Filmmaker Hall?
Yeah, but that's going too deep. We gotta get this movie made.
Yeah.
That's kind of a box
Bigger
office.
star,
Come
yeah.
on, Phil Baker Hall.
I was thinking like I was imagining like a fairly diminished guy. He's
Right,
super
yeah,
diminished.
yeah,
He's
yeah,
like
yeah.
slowly,
Yeah.
you know,
Gene
before
Hackman,
our
that's
eyes.
two Royal
Yeah.
Tenenbaums.
Trying to get a movie made
Yeah,
right now.
Yeah, exactly. Who would you? You're.
I don't know.
You
I
got
have-
1,000 people who would kill to play that part. It's so funny.
It's got to be a big fat guy
Bill Murray, perhaps.
in like a incredibly lifelike fat suit.
Yeah.
that would be good.
Nick
I
Nolte.
was thinking
Nick
Nick Nolte would be
Yeah.
good. Nah,
If you could
I don't-
understand
he's
anything
all
he said,
slurry
yeah,
now.
yeah.
I like that guy Oliver Platt, but I don't know if he's old
Oh,
enough.
yeah.
Oliver
He would
Platt
be
also.
great. Or Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Because he's a kind of a false staff character.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, how about you?
I don't know what No, I haven't. Do you guys think of your books as movies while you're writing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't.
Well, late at night, the fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even you don't know, it's such a movie though.
Yeah, but it doesn't. I mean, it's sort of designed in a. It's not cinematic actually, or it's just like too. Like the thing I really enjoy as a reader, one of the things I really enjoy as a reader and as a writer is sort of this like the long line of narrative, and that's not cinematic at all. You know, I like. There was this thing I could not kill it that I read. David Foster Wallace wrote, said it much better than this, but it was something like, you know, the reader feels really smart when there's something at the beginning and then they see it again, and like that's sort of what I enjoy. I enjoy those long narratives that kind of loop in on themselves, and that doesn't really, and that's what I try to do for, you know, how successful I was, but then that's not very movie-ish.
Any other questions?
I have a question. You all described the process of putting it in paper or computer right now as agonizing. Was it more agonizing because of the topic you chose, like the relationship with?
I think writing is one of the weird professions where it gets harder the longer you do it in your life. I don't know if you guys find this, but yeah, the sort of rigor and discipline that you acquire makes it increasingly difficult to do work that meets certain standards. So Yeah, I remember being a young writer in graduate school, and my professors talking about how agonizing it was, and I just thought it was so difficult to listen to them talk about how hard it was. I was like, oh, come on. So,
Because you wrote
young and
easily.
brash and overconfident, delusional.
It's also a terrible cliche, but it's also terribly true. It's no matter what you're writing, so much of it is, I mean, my advice always to writers or young writers is just write quickly and just get a story down. And that's not really writing, that's just getting the story down. Don't even think about the words, just get from the beginning to the end, and then go back and actually do the writing. And now you've got a 100-page story, it's a total mess, and you embrace the mess. But I'm not that way. I am, every step has to be solid before I take the next step. And then some bad days, I'll go back to the beginning just to check on it, and then it's like, that's 3 months down the well. Little Timmy, and there's no Lassie barking for me.
All right, well.
On that
I-
strange note.
Come
Come on, no, we can't end there. Another question, please.
I'll ask a question about three of you. Having written about these relationships, growing up, you all had your fathers, and you either liked them or didn't like them, or wanted somebody else's father in the neighborhood who you thought was the cool dad or the dad you wanted to have. Some of you have children now. Do you now have a sense of what perfect is too strong a word, but an ideal father, something that you would aspire to be for your own children? The way, not the weird little brother voice, but, because I have a son, and I read these books in part because I wanted some sort of insight into his relationship with his father. Lots of mother-daughter books to read about, and I'm that, and I live them. And I think that he always, growing up, had issues with his father and wished that he had other fathers, but as he got older, he saw that there were other, maybe more serious issues with those fathers,
Right.
and, so.
I think it's just a matter of being like the least disappointing. I think that some level of disappointment is built into the project. Because you can't do everything. You
Yeah.
can't be everything. It's just not possible.
It's such a day-to-day process too. There's no sense of kind of a wholeness to it, in which this is me as father. It's more like this is me as father Wednesday at 7:30 in the morning, and I'm trying to get them breakfast, and they don't want to eat breakfast. We gotta get to school, and I'm an awful man. And this is me as father Friday night at 7:30, reading to them in bed, and they're all cuddled around, and it's awesome. So it's like you just hope it's like any kind of relationship. You hope at the end of the day that you're at least at 51% good.